But where should I be? Yeah. No, you're looking at there. Oh. All right. So with no further ado, I'm going to introduce you, Clara, and we're all sorry that you couldn't be here with us. That was the plan. The latest mutant scuttled Clara's plan, and but thanks so much for being a good sport, and it's great to be with you together. We're all here and glad to meet you, and looking forward to hearing you. So just a few words about Clara, who did a 2-year postdoc at Harvard University, and then joined as an assistant professor at the Center for the History of Women Philosophers and Scientists, which we'd be happy to learn more about if you can tell us perhaps at the end of your talk or at the beginning of your talk, but also at the philosophy department at Paderborn University in Germany, which is where you are right now, I imagine. Clara's main interest lies in principal questions in the history and philosophy of science, in particular with regard to truth and knowledge. The main figures in her publications are Emilie du Chatelet, about whom we will hear today, but also Elisabeth von Böhmen, Descartes, Leibniz, Wolff, Kant, Heidegger, a very august procession of thinkers. And furthermore, Dr. Carus has been very active in promoting and pursuing research on women in the history of philosophy. And she's the co-founder and organizer of something called New Voices on Women in the History and Philosophy, and its talk series, about which we'd also be happy to hear about. So once again, thanks a lot for joining us, and we look forward to your words. The floor is yours.
Well, thanks so much for the introduction and for having me here. And I'm scared I'll be the boring part of your department celebration. So yeah, maybe I'm going to start and tell you a little bit about New Voices. As Oren already said, I'm assistant professor at the Center for the History of Women Philosophers and Scientists, which is virtually located at Paderborn University, but we do a lot of things online and really have a very international audience and community working together. And so New Voices is the group for emerging scholars in the widest sense, working on women in the history of philosophy and the sciences. And the idea is just, there are so many women in the history of philosophy and the sciences, which we don't really know much about. Comparatively, we have comparatively very little scholarship about figures like Emilie du Chatelet or Elisabeth von Böhmen, but also later on in the phenomenology, where I'm not, I don't know much about these figures, but other women, other people in my department work on these women. And the idea of New Voices is simply to get scholars together who work on women in the history of philosophy and the sciences worldwide. And we host an online talk series, and we have a searched scholar tool. So if you work on or are interested in a woman in the history of the sciences or in the history of philosophy, you can have a look on the website, and then I'll post that in the chat. And then you can find these people who work on this same person, and it's a great tool for networking. And we're also hosting the first New Voices online conference, which will feature talks on women in the history of philosophy all around the globe. And it'll take place on the 25th and 26th of February. And the call for abstracts is out at the moment. So if you're interested in contributing as a speaker, this is also still possible. Yeah, so how did I end up doing research on Emilie du Chatelet? I was working on Kant and Heidegger at Harvard, and I did a course with Alison Simmons on Descartes. And she had all these women authors who commented on Descartes or had a correspondence with Descartes. And Emilie du Chatelet is one of the very early readers of Descartes and has a very concise criticism and support of Descartes, which is in itself very interesting. But I read this material in the course, and I didn't actually know at the time that it was written by a woman. And because I was working on time in Kant and Heidegger, what she had written about time was particularly interesting to me. And I was like, oh, wait, why is this so interesting? And I don't know anything about this. I've never read anything about this. And then I found out that it was a text by a woman. And this is how I sort of more curiously ended up at working on Emilie du Chatelet. And I then did my postdoc on the early modern rationalists at Harvard, and du Chatelet is obviously a main figure in that monograph which I'm preparing. And yeah, while I was working on Emilie du Chatelet, I found out that her work is really groundbreaking in the early modern era, and that it's really just as important as works by Leibniz or Wolff, and that we just have very, very little scholarship about this, and many people don't even know about her work. So I became really interested in writing about her. And yeah, part of why I think her work is so important is because of her ideas on space and time, which I'm going to talk to you about today, and the epistemological way she considers these things, and also the way how she treats the principles of knowledge, which I won't go in today, but just to say there are a lot more aspects in her work that are really worth looking at. Yeah, and I know that you're a very interdisciplinary, diverse group, so it's great to have you as an audience, and I'm really excited to get to the Q&A. So I hope I won't take too long a time speaking, because I really want to get talking to you as well. So I do have a presentation which I'm now gonna share. Tired is mentioned. Oh, didn't want this. One second. Hello. So I had prepared everything, but the thing I put into the chat ruined it. So now. Yeah, so as I said, my talk will be about Emilie du Chatelet on space and time. And what I'm most interested in is the way she conceives of space and time, not actually what she says about it, but how she arrives at saying about it, at thinking about this. So I'll start with some preliminary remarks about this. And then I'm going to say a little bit about the context of the debate on time and space in the early modern era. Many of you will know about this, but it's just a little recap for those of you who are maybe not so much at home in this early modern debate, but there are things in there which you'll all have heard about, this debate about absolute and relative space and Newton's role in it and Leibniz's role in it. And this is really setting the stage for Emilie du Chatelet's approach to time and space. And so in the third point, I'm going to talk to you about how she considers time and space. And then in the fourth section, I'll actually go a little bit deeper into her investigation of the formation of our idea of space. As an example, du Chatelet's account of time is a little bit parallel to this, but even more extensive. So it didn't really fit into the space of a talk. And then I've got some concluding remarks at the end. So what I really wish to show is that she establishes an entirely new way of thinking about time and space, and that her way of thinking about time and space is not only based on physical mathematical premises, as in Newton, and that although she repeats Leibniz argumentation at the beginning of both chapters on time and space, it is also not only based and posited on theological metaphysical premises, as the argumentation mainly is based in Leibniz. And I focus on the premises for establishing arguments on time and space. So the way she considers these ideas of time and space. And I wish to show you that she's really got a new method of thinking about the constitution of the ideas of time and space through the mind as a faculty in relationship to real beings. So it's a newfound epistemological approach to time and space rather than arguing about what time and space are independently of how we conceive of time and space. So yeah, let me get straight to the first point of setting the context of the debate on time and space in the early modern era. And one of the most important figures in this debate is, of course, Newton and his work of the Principia. So what's actually Newton's assertion about absolute time and space in his mathematical philosophy of nature? We've all heard that Newton is somehow a defender of absolute space and time, or that this debate or arguments based on absolute space and time go somehow back to Newton. But how is this? So before Newton, the movement of one body could only ever be expressed in relationship to the rest of bodies or movement of another body. So movement could only be expressed in this relative way of one body relating to other bodies. And Newton's aim in his Philosophia Naturalis Principia Mathematica, or mathematical principles of natural philosophy, was to establish an absolute expression of movement. So one that's not relative to other bodies. And this absolute expression of movement should be independent of matter or of other bodies, and should be groundbreaking really for physics, because we could now absolutely calculate and express forces and movements independently of relating them to specific bodies. So he wanted to find a mathematical formula in which movement could be expressed absolutely without having to refer to other bodies. And Newton's distinction between relative and absolute space and time serves this aim. Newton claimed by means of sensual beings, space and time can only be perceived as relative. So if we look at actual sensual things, we can only relate, oh, this takes up so much space, or this lasts a certain time. And we can only have a notion of this time if we relate it to something else. So how long will this drive to the school last? Oh, it's the time of 2 Paw Patrol episodes, right? And this gives us an understanding of how long this is. But through mathematical principles, Newton thought, time and space can be represented as absolute. So independently of other sensual or spatial beings. So we thus have an absolute notion of space and time on the basis of mathematical principles. One that's not absolute here actually only means independent of something specific that is also timely or spatial that we have to relate it to have an understanding of this. So he did not say that we did not have this relative notion of space and time on the basis of sensual objects, but he said that we also have, independently of this relative notion of space and time, we can also have an absolute notion of space and time, which is not based on the senses, but is based on mathematical principles. And this notion of absolute space and time is crucial for an expression of absolute movement in Newton. And movement can then be expressed relative to absolute space and time, and thus independently of specific bodies. And that's in the end how he was able to formulate absolute formulas for movement. So Newton himself does not say much about the ontological status of absolute space and time based on mathematical principles. So he did not actually go much further. He said, on the basis of mathematical principles, we can have this notion of absolute space and time. So what are absolute space and time ontologically? Do they exist? Do they exist independently of sensual beings? How is space per se something absolute? Is time per se something absolute? What does this actually mean? Newton did not really go into any of these questions, but he makes clear that absolute space and time are not substances or accidents. But he does not say how we have to think about their beingness or their reality itself. There are some clues though. Newton says that absolute space and time are immense. And the debate that comes up in this context is, how do absolute space and time relate to God? Because if we consider space and time as something that is absolute, we come up with attributes of space and time as being infinite, as being endless, limitless, immense, as Newton says, right? They are not, they don't have any boundaries and things like that. So the problem that was during this time was, how do they relate to God, right? Because these attributes should be attributes that are exclusively attributes of God. So Newton's solution was they have to be represented as flowing out of God. They are somehow related to what God is itself. But he was not a theological writer as such. So he also didn't go deeply into that. So what space and time are themselves independently of a theory of movement is not central to Newton. The being of time and space itself is only thematized in relationship to an understanding of God, right? This is the only topic where the notion of time and space itself, independently of the question of movement, is somehow crucial. How do they relate to the understanding of God? And he has some quotes about that, but otherwise he did not really think about what is time, what is space, independently of this physical endeavor he had, or endeavor in physics he had, to express absolute movement. So how did Leibniz relate to this or come into this? Leibniz had the assertion of the relativity of time and space in his philosophy of what I call philosophy of religion, because it's really based on some theological premises, his ideas that time and space need be relative. So Leibniz is not alone in thinking that time and space are relative, i.e. relative only ever means dependent upon real beings, upon things that are spatial and that are timely. So it cannot subsist on its own. It's not a being independently of these other beings. This is the idea that time and space are relative. And he's not alone in thinking that, but has most of the history of philosophy behind him. And time and space is most comprehensively discussed by Leibniz in his letter correspondence with the Newtonian and theologian Samuel Clarke. He had some other queries into the nature of time and space in his mathematical writings, but they're mostly in line with what he says here. And in the opening paragraph of his first letter, Leibniz complains about the development of natural religion in England. And in his first sentence, Leibniz criticizes that in England, many turn souls into bodies and others turn God himself into a bodily entity. And the latter critique is directly addressed at Newton and the first at Newton's followers. And the latter critique is directly addressed at Newton because he compared absolute space to a sensorium of God. As we've heard before, absolute space is compared to flowing out of God or being like a sensorium of God. And this is what Leibniz addresses here and criticizes. And he goes on to argue against Newton's notion of absolute space and time, which Newton had established on the basis of mathematical principles in order to be able to express absolute motion. And he argues, so Leibniz argues, that time and space are not merely relative if conceived of in relationship to sensual things, but that they are ontologically relative beings per se and must not be represented as absolute. So his idea is, this idea of absolute space is wrong and absolute time is wrong. Time and space are merely relative beings per se. And Leibniz argues in line with a long historical tradition that time and space are nothing but the order of things. So we must only see time and space as being the order of timely and spatial beings. And without these timely and spatial beings, time and space are nothing. So what are Leibniz's arguments for space and time being merely relative beings and against the notion of absolute space and time? Leibniz's arguments are based on two different premises. And the first premise is what I call the godlike premise. The assumption here is absolute space and time would amount to God or attributes of God, and his own position or his argument against that is that God cannot be spatial or temporal, because if he was, he could also be divided, etc. And the conclusion is space and time cannot be considered to be absolute. So given, just to repeat this argument, given that absolute space and time existed, they would have to be God or attributes of God, because otherwise there would be something eternal, immense, etc. that is not God, which is incompatible with this theological view he also shared with Clarke and Newton. So they had the same position that there couldn't be anything different to God that could be eternal and immense and so on. But but he says the solution by Newton or by Clarke that space and time could be attributes of God or could be godlike or are somehow related to God don't work, because if they were, then God would be spatial or temporal, and then he could also be divided, and that's impossible, so space and time cannot be considered to be absolute. And the second argument is based on the principle of sufficient reason. The principle of sufficient reason is one of Leibniz's main, what he calls metaphysical principles. And it says that everything that happens need to have a sufficient reason for it to happen. And it's at the same, you could call it a principle of causation, but one that to Leibniz is not limited to nature, but to everything we can conceive of. So the PSR as a metaphysical principle serves as the argumentation base here. And so the assumption here is everything must have a reason, and even God has to have a reason for everything he does. That's what Leibniz claims, and that's what Clarke also agrees with. And the assumption is here, if space and time were absolute, God must arbitrarily have chosen where, when, and in which layout he created the world. Since the point in time, the place in space would have existed, but without any internal differences. And this arbitrary situation, according to Leibniz, is impossible because an absolute arbitrary situation is not a sufficient reason in Leibniz's definition. And the conclusion is that space and time cannot be absolute because of the choice without a reason scenario in God's creation of the world. So two arguments, both based on certain metaphysical premises and their relationship to God, or what Leibniz calls metaphysical premises, and their relationship to certain assumptions they shared about the nature of God. So there are a few problems with Leibniz premises. First, the godlike premise. The question is, can this concept of God be demonstrated or proven? Does this relate to belief, or does it relate to knowledge? A question that then in the Enlightenment became very debated. Then space and time could be differently eternal, immense, etc. to God. So maybe space and time are eternal and immense like God is, but somehow differently eternal or differently immense. And then it is also not demonstrated why God cannot be spatial or temporal, especially not if space and time are taken to be absolute. So if you cannot divide absolute space, or you cannot divide absolute time, as soon as you divide space and time, they are somehow linked to real beings. And you could argue space and time as in their absolute notion are also not divisible. So God maybe could be spatial or temporal. And then the second argument, the God's creation premise, has also some problems, say. The first one, can this concept of God be demonstrated or proven? Just the same as above. Then Leibniz proof of the PSR is a natural reason and not a reason for an action. I'm not going to go into this any further, but Kant later would criticize that that causality is only ever necessary in the realm, or objective in the realm, of possible experience, and in this way cannot be related to the concept of God, because the concept of God is not subject to possible experience. And so the PSR would be restricted to the realm of the recognition of nature. And here is the problem, how does the PSR hold for this God's creation premise? And then also this question of arbitrariness. So he said, Leibniz said, it can't be this situation because it would be an arbitrary situation, but we can maybe reestablish a similarly arbitrary situation in nature. We do have a cause, but maybe this cause is not a good reason for something, but could just as well have happened in a different way. Yeah, so can we therefore turn against Leibniz and towards Newton? So we could say, okay, these arguments are not convincing in the history of philosophy or the sciences. Maybe they have some roots in theology, but we have to reject them on these premises. But then we've also got a problem, and that is that Newton did not really say anything about what time and space as absolute beings are, i.e. what they are independently of sensual beings, and he did not deny the notion of relative space and time when viewed in relationship to sensual beings and not on the basis of mathematical principles. So what do we turn to here? Are space and time now absolute? Are they relative? And in what sense are they absolute? And in what sense are they relative? So it's interesting to see Emilie du Chatelet's notion of space and time within this context. Emilie du Chatelet translated Newton's Principia into French, and it's still the only complete French translation there is. So it's still the used one, and she was a very good Newton scholar, and she was also a follower of Leibniz, or an interpreter of Leibniz, and really introduced Leibniz via Wolff in the French speaking intellectual circles. And yeah, so she's really in the mix of the debate here. And her main work is called Institutions de Physique. And she says her opening chapter is on the principles of knowledge. And then she goes on to speak about God as well, but then also about space and time, and about some what she calls most essential philosophical concepts. So it's really the attempt to give an account of knowledge that is to support the science of physics at her time. And Emilie du Chatelet will come to argue that space and time are merely an order of things and relative to them. Without the existence of things, space and time are nothing, so comparable to Leibniz's position. And that there is nevertheless an absolute notion of space and time in our power of imagination, and that this notion of space and time in our power of imagination is useful for the sciences. So how does she arrive at this result? So I think that she does much more than reconciliating Newton with Leibniz. She constructs her argument on space and time on completely different premises. And it is these premises which allowed her to come to the reconciliatory conclusion on space and time. So it's not that she just puts Newton and Leibniz together, but she really looks at the nature of space and time in a different way than they did. And this is how she comes to unite their two seemingly contradictory positions. The nature of time and space themselves is in question for du Chatelet. So it is not, for her, it's not about their use for physical expression of absolute motion as it was in Newton. And it's also not in question their compatibility with a set concept of God as it was in Leibniz's letter correspondence. So if we remember, his first sentence is, I'm worried about the state of natural philosophy, natural religion in England. So I'm worried about these advances in the sciences that somehow contradict a certain conception of God. And if we remember Newton, it was about the expression of absolute motion. So it's not about these things for Emilie du Chatelet, but it is about the nature of space and time themselves. What are they? So how do I think that? So first of all, there's a dedicated chapter to both space and time in her main work, Institutions de Physique. Then she addresses space and time as important topics themselves. She says the question of the nature of space is one of the most famous that has divided ancient and modern philosophers alike. And she argues that the question of the nature of space and time is most essential because of its influence on the most important truths of physics and of metaphysics. So she believes that we have to look at what time and space are themselves, and that certain truths in physics and metaphysics depend on this question. And then I want to show you that she was very clear about the historical dispute on space and time. So this dispute of the Leibnizians and the Newtonians. And she says, I quote, "There are highly opposed definitions of space. Some have said," and this is quoting them, so to speak, in cursive, which is here in square. "Space is nothing over and above things. It is a mental abstraction, an ideal being. It is nothing other than the order of things as they coexist, and there's nothing to space except bodies." And then the others have, on the contrary, maintained that space is an absolute being, real and distinct from the bodies it contains, that it is an intangible, penetrable extension lacking solidity, the universal vessel that receives the bodies that are placed in it, in a word, a sort of immaterial and infinitely extended fluid in which bodies swim. Half of the philosophers believed and still believe in empty space, and the other half believe it to be filled with matter. The former group, so she's referring to the first group, space is nothing over and above things, has put forward several metaphysical reasons in support of their opinion. The others have put forward the idea of space that the imagination is able to form. And they have supported this idea using many objections against the contrary opinion. These objections are taken from the phenomena, and above all, from the difficulty there is with bodies moving in the absolute plenum. So she does believe that there must be reasons for both sides' arguments. And she distinguishes between the premises of the arguments. She says that the Leibnizians' arguments are based on metaphysical premises, while the Newtonian premises are somehow formed on a notion the imagination can form of time and space. So how come they can't come to a conclusion? So her own method is what she herself called an analysis of the idea of time, or an investigation of the formation of the idea of space. And in the first part of her chapters on space and time, du Chatelet repeats both of Leibniz premises, so the godlike premise and the God's creation premise on the basis of the PSR. And she argues for Leibniz's conclusion that space and time are nothing but an order of things and relative on the basis of these premises. But in both chapters, so in the chapter on space and in the chapter on time, she does not consider these premises or the explanation of space and time to be sufficient. And she adds her own second part of the chapters, where her premises and her argumentation changes completely, and which she introduces distinctively. So she says about the idea of space that she wants to inquire how we form the idea of space and its properties. So it's an examination here, how we came to form our ideas of extension, space, and continuity. So an epistemological inquiry into how we can conceive of the idea of space itself. And the same is true with time, where she says, but furthermore, we are going to see by the analysis of our ideas that time is only an abstract being, and so on. So she wants to analyze our idea of time, and she wants to investigate how we form the idea of space. And this is really what her method consists in. And she starts with an explanation of extension. And she says that we conceive of absolute space by virtue of the way we conceive of extension. And so the notion of how we come to think about extension is what she starts with. And she says, we feel that once we consider two things as different, and when we distinguish them, the one from the other in our minds, we place one external to the other. Thus, everything that we consider to be different from us, we see as external to us. There are many examples of this. If in our imagination we represent to ourselves a structure that we have never seen before, we represent it as external to ourselves, even though we know well that the idea we have of it exists within us and that there is perhaps nothing of this structure existing external to our idea. So what's interesting here is that she really looks at this in terms of how does the faculty form the notion of extension. So there's already the idea here that somehow our faculties or our capacities are involved in the notion of extension. And she goes on, it follows from this that we cannot represent to ourselves several different things as being one, without this resulting in a notion that is attached to this diversity and to this union of things. And this notion we call extension. So her argument is we can only, what we do when we form the notion of extension is we think of two different things and that they are united in being extended, and that our notion of extension really entails nothing other than this, that there's somehow a plurality of things that are different, that are a diversity, and that they are united in being extended. And all the other aspects of what these beings are is abstracted from in this notion of extension. So they might be blue, they have this and that shape, they might be 5 or 2, and all these things don't matter. The only thing for our notion of extension matters that there's somehow a diversity and a union in beings being extended. And she goes on to say, once we pay attention to this notion of extension, we perceive that the parts of extension, when considered abstractly and without taking into account either their limits or their shapes, must not have any internal differences. They must be similar and differ only in number. For since in order to form the idea of extension, we consider only the plurality of things and their union, from which their existence external to one another originates. And we exclude every other determination, all the parts being the same with respect to plurality and unity. We can substitute one in the place of another without destroying these two determinations, the plurality and the unity, which are the only determinations to which we are paying attention. And so any two parts of extension can differ from each other only in being two and not one. So she says the parts of an extension, they don't have the limits or the shapes and so on anymore, because in this very notion of extension, we abstract from all of these determinations beings might have, and we only consider their quantity and their union in being extended. And this is why all of extension must be conceived of as being uniform, homogeneous, and having no internal determination that distinguishes one part from another, since if we place these parts however we wish, the result will always be the same being, and that is how we arrive at the idea of absolute space, which we consider to be homogeneous and indiscernible. So she says, because we need this notion of where we abstract from everything else in these beings, but only consider their plurality and their union in extension. We conceive of this notion of extension itself only consisting of this diversity and union. And what we have as a result is that we can place one part of extension and the other, we can just push this around however we want to and nothing changes. And this is how we form the idea of absolute space in our imagination. And we then envisage that this extension can subsist by itself, because in conceiving it, we have no need of the other determination. So we can, in our imagination, think about this without thinking of something blue or something having this shape or having any sort of other determination. Since we consider these beings only insofar as they are diverse and united, because our mind perceives these determinations separately, those which constitute this ideal being that we call extension, and then conceives the other qualities that we have mentally separated from it and that are no longer part of the idea we have of this being, it seems to us that we import all these things into this ideal being and that we house them there, and that extension receives and contains them as a vessel receives liquid that is poured into it. So we now have a notion of extension, of absolute space, right? This is something that we conceive of as subsisting by itself, and then we place all the other objects in it. And we think that this book here that is in space is somehow sort of thrown into this or poured into a universal vessel. But she makes clear that this notion of absolute space only appears to be able to subsist without real beings. But since we can know in considering how we came up with the idea of space in the first place, since it is formed through an abstraction from real beings, the notion of space is dependent upon that which is abstracted from, right? So it is dependent upon real beings. If there was nothing we could have abstracted it from, then we couldn't have the later notion of abstraction. Du Chatelet thus explains in her investigation of how we form the idea of space that the idea of space is formed through an act of abstraction by the mind or by the power of the imagination, and that this abstraction is dependent upon the beings it is abstracted from. And she can thus explain that firstly, we form an imaginary notion of absolute space in our power of the imagination. So we can actually conceive of absolute space and time through this power of our own mind. But this imaginary notion or mind notion of space as a uniform entity is utilizable for mathematics and for physics. So we can use this to have all sorts of calculations in mathematics or in physics. So what Newton does is legitimate, right? But on epistemological premises, this notion of space is ontologically, i.e. in its being, dependent upon that which it was abstracted from, so dependent on real beings. So as a conclusion, space is thus in its being an abstraction of the mind, and as this abstraction an order of things relative to and reliant upon real beings. So only because we can form this absolute notion of space and time in our power of the imagination, in an epistemological sense, we must not forget that this imaginary notion of absolute space and time in our imagination is only a result of an abstraction and is therefore in its existence dependent upon real beings, which it was abstracted from. And Du Chatelet advances a parallel and in some ways even more extensive explanation of the nature of time. Yeah, so I'm going to conclude with a summary. According to du Chatelet, the mind forms in an act of abstraction an abstract notion of extension and of succession, which is time and space respectively. And this abstract notion of space and time is attributed to the power of the imagination and is as such applicable to science. Yet because these abstract notions come about through an act of abstraction by our faculty, the mind, they are dependent upon that which they are abstracted from. So if you think that right, we can relate that to quantity. If we can only have a notion of number because we somehow derive that from things that we can actually count, and then we have that idea of what we can actually count, but the countability is still dependent upon that there was something at some point that we were able to count. Thus, space and time as abstract notions are relative to and dependent upon real beings and only express their order. In her investigation of the formation of our idea of space and her analysis of the idea of time, du Chatelet explains what the faculty of the mind does in relationship to real beings. She explains how the idea of space and time has to be understood on this basis. So my point here is, Leibniz, for example, he also has this comparison to number and all these things. He also claims that time and space are only in order of things, but he cannot really explain how we come up with the idea of absolute space and time and how we use it in the sciences. And that is because he does not really look at how we form the idea of space in the first place, or how we can analyze the idea of time itself. So this notion that we have of time, or the notion that we have of space, how are they formed in our mind? So this is a newfound way to think about space and time in Emilie du Chatelet, and it is not based on mathematical premises or religious premises alone, but on what it is that is entailed by our very own ideas of space and time. And she emphasizes that in philosophy, it has to be made clear and explained that the abstract notion of space and time as used in mathematics and physics is not a substance, i.e. a being subsisting by itself independently of real beings, and why. Of course, it has to be explained why it is not a substance. And she can also explain why the Newtonians attribute immensity, eternity, etc. to absolute space, and why they make the mistakes of attributing this to space as if space were a substance. So she explains, yeah, it's clear that when we have this abstract notion of space in our imagination, then we conceive of it as immense, eternal, and so on. But because this very imaginary notion of absolute space and time in our mind is dependent upon real beings, it's not really immense or eternal and so on, because it's not a substance, it's not a being subsisting in itself, but only an ideal being of our mind. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Clara. And I guess we'll open up to questions. But before we do that, could you just give us a little bit of background about Emilie du Chatelet's life, where she lived, when she lived, and what her background was, how she came to these ideas?
Yeah, so Emilie du Chatelet is a French, natural philosopher. She did not really define herself in any way. She sometimes refers to herself as, or she sometimes writes about philosophers, counting herself among them, and then about physicists, counting herself among them, and then about mathematicians, counting herself among them. It's not unusual in her time of the early modern period. She had she was of a how do you say adelig? 1 second, I'm just stuck in. You know, she was from a well-off family, and she was Duchess or whatever. I don't know the proper translation, a countess. She was married, and she had 2 children from her first marriage. And then she factually was separated from her husband, but she wasn't divorced or anything. But she had a long period in which she lived with Voltaire, and they worked together as well, both writing on the nature of fire and debating about force vive, and in a lot of works on Emilie du Chatelet, her relationship to Voltaire is very centralized. And then they separated, I think many say because he started a relationship with his much younger niece. And after some time, she had a relationship with a soldier, or a man who was in the military, and not 100%. I'm not the best person to ask about her life, because I'm very much involved with what she wrote about. There are many people who can tell you all of this much better than I can. But yeah, she was expecting a child with this man, and she died shortly after giving birth to her 3rd child, a daughter, because of childbirth complications when she was only 42, I believe. So her life was cut very short. But you can find out more about her life if you look at the directory of women philosophers and scientists on our website. We are just updating this. Yeah. So here you can find out more about her biography and things like that. Yeah, so she was shortly after Descartes, Leibniz involved, but Wolff and Leibniz were still alive during her creative phase when she was writing. And as you can see shortly before Kant refers to her in his dissertation. And in some longer passages. Yeah, but we don't really know how much he knew about her or read her. There are certain, we know that he's obviously read her works on the force vive, because that's what he comments on there. We don't really know how much he read of the Institution de Physique, which is really her main work. She's also written, she's translated Mondeville's Fable of the Bees, and she has an extensive preface to this. And she's written an essay on freedom and a discourse on happiness. So it's very diverse, the topics she's written about.
Clara, you can't see me, but how was this effort at conciliation between Leibniz and Newton received, and especially by the Newtonians, who probably didn't so much see it as an effort at conciliation as much as an attack, I would imagine. But how was it received?
Yeah, it's very difficult to answer because I've been looking into this exactly. So it's a very, very interesting question, and I just can't find much about it. So obviously, like this idea that time and space are somehow looked at in terms of our faculties became then very prominent in the history of philosophy, but how it is received by the Newtonians, or you know, who read this at all, it's really somehow difficult to establish. So unfortunately, I have to say that I don't really know much. Yeah, I've really been looking into this, but it's really difficult to find out, especially because a lot of her definitions were taken on board, but oftentimes without her name attached to it, so anonymously. Her Institution de Physique was published in her name, right? But for example, there are many definitions of hers also on phenomena and all these things in the encyclopedia by Diderot and d'Alembert, which was really the main lexica at the time. So our internet, basically. And there are her definitions in there, which we can prove today with like digital means much better than we used to, but they are lacking her name on it. So it's very difficult to trace who read what, and you know, because often the source is actually missing. And also we're only really at the beginning of even discovering her as a writer on time and space in that period. So up until now, we've got a lot of scholarship on Newton, and we have a lot of scholarship on Leibniz and on Wolff. And this debate on absolute and relative time and space was pretty much set, and there was a sort of set narrative of the Leibnizian position and the Newtonian position that was retold in the classes on the history of philosophy for many, many years. And now we're kind of trying to fit her into this debate, and many things have to be looked at in a new way and in a new perspective. And my work is very much focused on establishing what is it she herself wrote. How do we have to read what's actually in there? But then you of course have to go another step after this and see how does it fit into this period? How was it received? How was it commented on? How do people relate to it? Who read this? And who read this without ever mentioning it? Who read this without her name on it? And there are many, many things we don't know. And hopefully many things we will find out.
Well,
There we go.
Hi. Thank you. It was fascinating. And I have a very simple question. I was wondering whether there is an implicit gendered implication to your talk or subtext to your talk, whether I'm speculating whether the primacy of the real over the abstract and the primacy of abstraction over an abstract thing, whether you would suggest it's typical to a minority position?
I mean, I think there are some things you can maybe read into it. For me personally, it's not my main perspective. So I just come with an interest in the history of philosophy, and I just discovered this writer and have found out that there's not much original scholarship about a very interesting position, and that's why I'm interested in this. And also because I'm just interested in a lot of things she's written. And of course, also, if you work on these things, it's not as interesting just writing about what other people have written about an author. It's interesting to look at the sources themselves, right? So this is my motivation mainly. But yeah, I think there are some things that are maybe different in her and that you could attribute to maybe her being a woman writing. So what occurred to me is that a lot of women actually emphasize the importance of the history of ideas for their works. So Emilie du Chatelet, in her preface, she writes that all the great intellectuals or thinkers build on each other, and that there was no Kepler without Huygens, and there was no Newton without Galilei, and that she has this really sort of to the point, in a nutshell quote where she says, no book is good enough that you can't add to it, and no book is bad enough that it's not, that you can't take anything from it, that it's not worth reading it. So, and she says that in the matters of philosophy and physics, the sciences, is really where your love for your country has to stand back, and you just have to be completely open and not make science a matter of your country, and be really impartial in this sense. So she very much emphasized the importance of being internationally open, just being objective, not sticking to something because making yourself an apostle of a specific other person, and also the worth of building on other people's ideas. And that's also what she does. She very much emphasizes, for example, what Descartes brought into the history of philosophy positively, and then she also criticizes Descartes. And the same you can see here with the Newtonians, right? Like, she doesn't just say, no, space and time are not absolute. She gives an explanation as to how they come up with the notion of absolute space and time, why it is legitimate in physics, and doesn't just reject this. And the same with the Leibnizians. She doesn't just say, yeah, space and time are relative and so on. She doesn't just repeat this, but she goes a bit further in explaining why can we think of space and time as being absolute. So whether or not this is a female trait or not, I can't say, but it's certainly a bit of a tendency I've read in, say, a lot of male authors have in their preface how they are the first one in history establishing a certain idea, or how it's different to what everybody else has done, or how it's an entirely new premise. And what I've read a lot, not only in Du Chatelet, but also in Elizabeth of Bohemia, for example, and other female authors, is this relationship to some sort of history of ideas, appreciation or rejection of some things in there, and taking this seriously. Yeah, but it's not really the cause of why I'm doing this. So the project, it's of New Voices, is gender-based insofar as it brings together scholars who work on women in the history of philosophy and the sciences. But this is really because, to me, it's just because we really have a lack of scholarship on especially these people and these writers and authors. And to me, myself, it's only interesting if it is something that interests me as within the history of philosophy or the history of the sciences and so on. Yeah, obviously there you can have a different perspective on this.
If I could just add to Noam's question. So you do sit in a center for the study of women philosophers. And I wonder, to what degree there's a sort of within the gamut of scholars who are your colleagues there, I wouldn't say pressure, but there's a sort of moment of some of the scholars to do precisely what you sound somewhat reticent to do, i.e., to try to read some gendered analysis into your work, and to what degree their argument is, this is what we're here to do. Actually, we want to define how new voices or different voices speak and why they speak that way. That's what we're here to do. You sound like you're a classical philosopher of science who's interested in ideas, and this woman just happened to be gendered female to you. But do you feel that some of your colleagues would like you to go further, and are there arguments within the center about these kind of issues?
Yeah, I don't really think there's any pressure on this. So I do think that some of my colleagues could have a stronger view on actually like only working on women in the history of philosophy or the sciences, or have a maybe stronger feminist perspective on thereby change, like having a stronger feminist aim in the sense of changing the current state of female in academics and things like that. And also within the New Voices group, there are a lot of people who are interested in a lot of different feminist ideas and things like that. But it's really a very open group, New Voices and the Center for the History of Women Philosophers and Scientists. So I've also continued to work on Kant. I teach Kant. I teach Descartes. Like it's not like I only work on women in the history of philosophy. So yeah, and you got me exactly right. To me, it's just, I'm interested in the history of philosophy, and I'm interested in whoever is interesting in there. And Emilie du Chatelet happens to be this and be a woman. And what's interesting to me is that she's not been read and not been written about, right? So I really see this desiderata there, and that it's worth writing about her. But yeah, you can have totally different perspectives on that, and I don't think there's, like, from my side, I've not experienced any pressure to look at this differently, or to go about this with a different interest. And I think there's a big community now in philosophy departments who just out of their interest work on women in the history of philosophy, or on women in the history of the sciences. I mean, like with an interest in their field, and not just with an interest in promoting some form of gender work.
Or it's, yeah.
Can I ask a question, please?
Wait, Tippy, you just write in the chat that you'd like to ask a question.
Yeah, Yaakov was before me.
Oh, really? Oh.
Thank you. Yes. Thank you, Clara, for a very interesting talk. Let me just briefly say I'm a professor emeritus in the Faculty of Mechanical Engineering at the Technion, Israel Institute of Technology. So I'm pretty far from Emilie du Chatelet and philosophy of science. But then on the other hand, I'm very close to it because that's what we do. But I'd like to ask the following question, if I may. She deduces the nature of space and time by thought experiments, at least in part as you described it. And she describes the discovery of space by first the discovery of extension, which is sort of the way an infant discovers space. My youngest grandson, 4 months old, is discovering space. So my question is, does she consider these thought experiments being influenced not only by the nature of space and time, but by the nature of our own minds? That is, the abstraction of space and time depends on real beings, she said. But does she also say that the abstraction is based on the nature of our minds? And that if our minds were different, if we were Martians or something, might the whole story come out totally different?
Yeah, so she does say that the notion of space and time itself depends on this act of the mind, right? Of this act of abstraction that is done by the mind, or she sometimes says by the power of the imagination. So yeah, it's definitely, and this does not mean that if we weren't there, that things weren't spatial or timely, right? So things are spatial and timely, but for us to have a notion of space and time, so to think like, oh, time means this and that, and this is time and this is space, and that I can say these words and mean something by saying it. This is because of an act of the mind, because of an abstraction. Yeah, and this is really also one of the most interesting points that she's so explicit about this. So yeah, it's not really only a thought experiment. So it's what she does is asking, how do we form this notion of space and time? So we don't necessarily have to know about this, right? So it's not that for all of us to talk to each other about space and time, we have to know that to arrive at this notion of space and time, we have abstracted of real beings, and we have, and so on, right? But what she does is reflecting upon what is entailed in the formation of the idea of space and time, and always entailed therein. And what she says is, yeah, there are real beings which we abstract from, but to do this, we need an act of the power of imagination or the mind.
Thank you.
Thank you for this fascinating perception of time and space. I didn't know Emilie du Chatelet. I don't know how to pronounce her name, sorry. I have one question. It seems like she, and I think maybe Leibniz and Newton, I don't know much about them in relation to space and time, but it seems like they take time and space as different properties, and they try to see how they react with nature. But I would like to ask if she has some perception about the relation between time and space, and how that affected by the mind or to the mind.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a specialist on this, but yeah, she has a whole theory on motion And then also in her consideration of measurement, this is really important. So what du Chatelet says is that often the measurement of time is confused with time itself. And for the measurement of time, we always need this relationship to some form of spatial body, right?
Yes.
And so because we have to say that the Earth turns around once while the sun is in this position or that position, and otherwise you cannot measure a day or the time it takes around for the Earth to turn and so on. But she says the measurement of time is only based on an idea of duration we already have independently of this measurement of time, and that we have to distinguish the notion of duration, which is primary to this notion of the measurement of time. And in this way, the relationship of space and time is discussed and is essential. And then also for her idea of motion. But I'm not, this goes into like the more physical part of her work, which is also quite extensive, and I'm not a specialist on. But yeah, it's definitely something she considers. Yeah.
Okay, so are any further questions? Let me thank you and all of us for a wonderful talk. And since we are all like meeting when it comes to time, we know it's relative. And we wish that you arrive here in our country one day and that we're able to meet you in person. But thanks so much for joining us tonight from Germany. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for having me, and thanks for the great questions.
Thank you. Good night.